The day everything changed. It started as just another ordinary morning, but there was a strange feeling in the air, one I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something more. I groaned as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my head pounding slightly as if I had been running a marathon in my sleep. A dull ache settled in my throat, scratchy and raw, and my body felt heavy like I had been carrying a weight I hadn't noticed until now. Great, I muttered to myself. Just what I need. I had been pushing myself too hard at work lately. Late nights, early mornings, and weekends that blurred together in an endless cycle of meetings and deadlines. My body was finally waving a white flag, demanding that I slow down. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, but even as I stood up, a slight dizziness made me pause. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe I could shake it off with some coffee. But deep down, a nagging thought told me to get it checked out. I wasn't one to overreact when it came to my health. I usually powered through colds and minor illnesses with a mix of stubbornness and caffeine. But this felt different. I had an important meeting at work in a few days, and I needed to be at my best. If this turned into something worse, I'd regret not acting sooner. With a sigh, I grabbed my phone and searched for the number of the local clinic. A few rings later, a receptionist picked up. "Good morning, Maplewood Health Clinic. How can I help you?" "Oh, hi. I was wondering if I could get a walk-in appointment today. I think I might be coming down with something." There was a short pause as she checked the schedule. "We have an opening in an hour. Does that work for you?" "Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks." I hung up and exhaled slowly. It was just a checkup, nothing serious. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness gnawing at the back of my mind. A walk that felt different. The clinic was only a short walk from my apartment, but as I stepped outside, I felt the cold February air bite against my skin. The world seemed muted. Cars hummed softly in the distance. People passed by bundled in scarves and coats, and the usual morning rush had an almost sluggish quality. As I walked, I found myself thinking about how much I had been neglecting my health, not just physically, but in every way. Work had taken over my life. It had been months since I'd done anything just for myself. No vacations, no downtime, not even a real conversation that wasn't about deadlines or deliverables. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Maybe this was my body's way of forcing me to hit pause. When I arrived at the clinic, the waiting room was half full. A few people were sniffling, some scrolling through their phones, others staring blankly at the walls, lost in thought. I checked in at the front desk and took a seat, flipping through an old magazine. But I wasn't really reading. My mind kept drifting, restless. Something about today just felt different. A name I didn't recognize. "Mr. Donnelly." I looked up. A nurse stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand. "That's me." I stood and followed her down a hallway lined with posters about flu prevention and heart health. She led me into a small examination room with white walls, a desk in the corner, and a simple exam table covered in sterile paper. "The doctor will be with you shortly," the nurse said as she took my vitals. She jotted something down on her clipboard and smiled before heading out. I sat there, tapping my fingers against my knee. I had been here a couple of times before, but I had always seen Dr. Morrison, an older man with a gruff but kind demeanor. I glanced at the plaque on the door. Dr. Carlo Williams. New doctor, or maybe I just hadn't been paying attention before. There was a soft knock at the door. "Mr. Donnelly." The door opened, and I looked up, only to freeze for a second. Dr. Williams wasn't what I had expected. She looked young, probably late 20s or early 30s, with striking green eyes that stood out against her smooth brown skin. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she wore a light blue coat over her clothes, giving her a sharp professional look. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught me off guard. It was the way she carried herself. Confident, warm, and something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Please, "Have a seat," she said, her voice smooth and inviting, like she actually cared about what I had to say. I sat, trying to push away my sudden self-awareness. "So what brings you in today?" she asked, settling into her chair across from me. I cleared my throat. "I've been feeling off since last night. Sore throat, bit of dizziness. Just off. I figured I should get checked out before it turns into something worse." She nodded thoughtfully, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Given the season, it's likely just a mild viral infection, but let's take a look to be sure." She moved through the exam swiftly but carefully, checking my throat, my breathing, my temperature. Her touch was gentle but precise, like she had done this 1,000 times, but still took her time to be thorough. After a few moments, she leaned back with a small smile. "Well, the good news is it's nothing serious. Likely just a cold. I'd recommend rest, plenty of fluids, and some over-the-counter meds to manage the symptoms." I exhaled in relief. "So no secret deadly virus?" She chuckled. "Nope, just an annoying but harmless one." She scribbled something on a prescription pad, tore the paper off, and handed it to me. "Here's something to help with the congestion and throat pain." I glanced at the paper and blinked. Beneath the prescription details, in neat handwriting, was a phone number. And beneath that, a small note. "Tea helps, so does talking. If you need either, call." I stared at it for a moment, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. Was this a mistake? A joke? I glanced up at her, but her expression was unreadable, except for a small, knowing smile. I swallowed. Thanks." "Anytime," she said, standing up and holding the door open for me. I walked out of the clinic in a daze, the crisp air doing little to clear my thoughts. The number felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe she did this for all her patients. Maybe it was just a friendly gesture. But then I remembered the way she looked at me when she handed it over. Not just as a doctor, as something else. And suddenly, this ordinary day didn't feel so ordinary anymore. The weight of a number. I walked home in a haze, my mind tangled with thoughts I couldn't quite unravel. The prescription paper, now folded neatly in my jacket pocket, felt heavier than it should. Had I imagined it? I reached my apartment, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. My body still ached, and my throat still burned, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Dr. Carla Williams. She had been warm, professional, thorough. But that note, "Tea helps, so does talking. If you need either, call," was something else. I fished the paper from my pocket and stared at it again. The number was written in small, neat handwriting beneath the prescription details. Not the clinic's number. Her number. I ran my thumb over the ink, half expecting it to disappear, as if it had been a mistake. Maybe it was. Maybe she had meant to write something else. Maybe this was just how she treated all her patients. But something about the way she had handed it to me, the way her eyes lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, told me otherwise. I set the paper down on the counter and walked to the bathroom, turning on the sink to splash cold water on my face. I needed to clear my head. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, looking just as confused as I felt. What was I supposed to do with this? Calling the unknown. For the rest of the afternoon, I tried to distract myself. I made tea. I put on a movie. I even attempted to get some work done. But the number sat in the back of my mind like an unanswered question. At one point, I picked up my phone and typed the number into my contacts, hovering my thumb over the save button. I hesitated. What if this was a bad idea? What if I called and it turned out to be nothing? A mistake, a joke, a simple act of kindness I was reading too much into. But what if it wasn't? I put the phone down. No, I wasn't going to call. Not today. I had no reason to. But then, an hour later, I found myself staring at my phone again. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And then, "Hello." Her voice was warm, familiar, the same calm confidence she had in the clinic. I swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Oh, hi, it's Dylan. Dylan Donnelly. From this morning." A pause. Then a soft chuckle. "I was wondering if you'd call." "Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should. I didn't want to. I don't know. Overstep." "You're not overstepping," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I wouldn't have given you my number if I didn't mean it." I felt my chest loosen slightly. "Well, I just wanted to say thanks. For, being a great doctor. And for this." "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I could tell you needed a little more than just cold medicine." That threw me off. "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment before saying, "I see a lot of patients, Dylan, and most of them are in a rush to get their medicine and leave. But when you walked in, you looked like you weren't just fighting a cold. You looked tired, like you'd been carrying something for a while." I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. She had seen it. The exhaustion, the weight I hadn't even realized was showing. "I know it's not my place," she added, her tone softer now. "But sometimes, when you've been pushing yourself too hard, all you need is for someone to remind you to slow down." That's all the note was. Just a reminder. I exhaled. Something about the way she said it made me feel like I didn't have to put up a front with her. "Yeah," I admitted. "You're not wrong. Work's well, it's been a lot. And I haven't really been taking care of myself like I should." "Then maybe it's time you did," she said simply. I leaned back against the couch, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, maybe it is." We were quiet for a few seconds, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was comfortable. "So," she said, breaking the pause, "have you had any tea yet?" I let out a laugh. I actually did. Figured I should follow doctor's orders." "Good," she said playfully. "Then you're already on the path to recovery. Guess I owe you for that, huh? You could always make it up to me by buying me a cup of coffee sometime," she said, her voice light, but with a teasing edge. My brain short-circuited for a second. "Wait, you mean, like coffee," she said simply. "Nothing serious. Just 2 people having a conversation without a stethoscope in the room." I hesitated, but not because I didn't want to. I just hadn't expected her to say it first. And yet the moment she did, I knew my answer. "I'd like that," I said. "A lot, actually." "Great," she said. "How about Saturday? There's a cafe not far from the clinic. Quiet, good coffee. I think you'd like it." I grinned. "Sounds perfect." "Then it's a date," she said, and even though she said it casually, I couldn't help but feel my heart skip a beat. A date. We said our goodbyes, and when I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. Somehow, what had started as a routine visit to the clinic had turned into something else entirely. Something unexpected. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but I wanted to see where it led. I let out a breath and smiled to myself. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Coffee and conversations. Saturday morning arrived with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. I woke up before my alarm, a rare occurrence for someone who usually hits snooze at least 3 times. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about work deadlines, unanswered emails, or the never-ending list of tasks that had been dictating my life. No, today was different. Today, I had a coffee date. With my doctor. That thought alone made my stomach flip. It had been a long time since I'd gone on a real date, if this even counted as one. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would we sit there awkwardly, realizing that outside of a clinical setting, we had nothing in common? Or would it feel as easy and natural as our phone call? I shook my head, pushing away the doubts. Just relax. It's coffee, not a marriage proposal. I got ready carefully, making sure I looked presentable without seeming like I had tried too hard. Dark jeans, a clean button-down, and a jacket that was warm enough for the crisp February air. By the time I left my apartment, my nerves had settled into something more manageable, until I reached the cafe. Seeing her outside the clinic, I spotted her before she saw me. She was sitting by the window, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. And she looked different. Not in a drastic way, but seeing her outside of the clinic, without the white coat and professional demeanor, was almost surreal. She wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked real, not just as Dr. Williams, but as Carla. I took a breath and stepped inside. She noticed me immediately, a smile spreading across her face. "Hey, you made it." I grinned, sliding into the seat across from her. Yeah, well, I figured ignoring doctor's orders twice in 1 week would be bad for my health. She chuckled. Smart man. The cafe was warm, the scent of coffee and fresh pastries filling the air. Outside, the world moved at its usual pace. Cars passing by, people walking their dogs, life happening as it always did. But inside, it felt like time had slowed just a little. A waitress appeared, and I ordered a black coffee. "So," Carla said, leaning forward slightly, "are you feeling better?" "Physically, yeah. The medicine helped. And the tea." I smirked. "But I think I'm starting to suspect you prescribed it just so you'd have an excuse to check if I actually drank it." Her eyes twinkled. Busted. The conversation flowed naturally from there. We talked about everything. Work, life, childhood memories. She told me about growing up in a small town before moving to the city for mid-school, about how she had always wanted to be a doctor but never imagined working in a clinic instead of a hospital. "It's funny," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "When you go into medicine, everyone assumes you want to be a surgeon or work in a big hospital saving lives every second of the day. But I like the small moments, the simple interactions. I like knowing my patients, really knowing them. It feels more personal." I nodded, understanding more than I expected. That makes sense. People underestimate the small moments, but they're the ones that matter the most. She tilted her head slightly. "You say that like someone who's learned it the hard way." I let out a breath. "Yeah, I guess I have." She didn't press, didn't ask for details. She just gave me a look that said she understood. And somehow, that was enough. Something unexpected. We must have been there for nearly 2 hours, but it didn't feel like it. I barely noticed the other customers coming and going, the hum of conversation around us blending into the background. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about work or stress or anything else. I was just there, with her, and I liked it. When we finally left the cafe, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the city. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as we walked toward the main street. She smiled. "I should be the one thanking you. I don't usually do this." I raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" She hesitated. "Give my number to patients. Meet them for coffee." My heart skipped. "Then why did you?" She stopped walking, turning to face me. "Because, I don't know. There was something different about you." I swallowed. "Different how?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm not sure, but I wanted to find out." The air between us shifted. It wasn't heavy or awkward, just charge. Something was happening here, something neither of us had expected. Before I could say anything else, she exhaled and smiled. "I should go. Early shift tomorrow." I nodded. "Right. Of course." She hesitated for a second, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "Here," she said, handing it to me. I unfolded it, my chest tightening slightly when I saw what it was. Another note. This time, it just said, "Let's do this again." I looked up at her, and she grinned. "Good night, Dylan." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, holding the note. A new beginning. As I walked home, I couldn't stop smiling. This wasn't just a simple doctor-patient interaction anymore. This was something more. Something I wasn't ready to label. Something I wanted to see through. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. More than just a coincidence. The days after our coffee date passed in a strange blur, a mix of routine and something new that lingered in the back of my mind. Work was still demanding, emails still flooded my inbox, and deadlines still loomed, but something had shifted. Or maybe I had. It was a subtle difference, but I could feel it in the way I moved through my day. Less rushed, less robotic. I found myself pausing to enjoy moments I would have ignored before. The warmth of the morning coffee in my hands, the way the city lights flickered against the skyline at night, the simple comfort of stretching after a long day. And then, of course, there was her, Carla Williams. I hadn't expected to meet someone like her, least of all during a routine checkup at the clinic. And yet here we were. Her last note, "Let's do this again," had been sitting on my nightstand since that evening. I'd read it more times than I cared to admit, running my fingers over the ink as if it held some deeper meaning I hadn't yet unlocked. It was just a few words, simple enough, but they carried a promise, a quiet assurance that this wasn't over yet. And I didn't want it to be. A call I didn't expect. I was knee-deep in work late one evening when my phone rang. Glancing at the screen, I felt a small jolt of surprise. Carla. I wasn't expecting her to call. Our last interaction had been left open-ended, neither of us setting an exact time for another meetup. I picked up quickly, trotting, and failing to keep my voice casual. Hey, Dylan. Her voice was softer than usual, but there was something else in it, something off. Everything okay? I asked, sitting up in my chair. A small pause, then a sigh. Yeah, She hesitated, and that was enough to make my stomach twist slightly. Carla was always composed, always sure of her words. Hearing uncertainty in her voice was unsettling. What's going on? I pressed gently. She let out a small laugh, but it wasn't her usual warm one. It was tired, almost strained. Long day at the clinic, she admitted. One of those days where everything just weighs on you, you know. I did. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the back of my neck. I get it. Another pause. Then, quietly, I didn't know who else to call. Her words caught me off guard. Carla was the kind of person who handled things on her own. I could tell that much from the short time I'd known her. She wasn't the type to need someone. And yet, she had called me. That realization sent something warm through my chest. I'm glad you did, I said honestly. She exhaled slowly, and I imagined her sitting somewhere, maybe on her couch, running a hand through her hair the way she did when she was thinking. I don't want to unload on you, she murmured. You're not, I reassured her. Tell me about it. She hesitated for only a second before she did. And for the next half hour, she talked. She told me about the patients she had seen that day, about the moments that stuck with her, the elderly man who had come in alone, the young mother who had been juggling 2 kids while trying to get a prescription filled, the teenager who had broken down in tears because he was too scared to tell his parents he needed therapy. I know I can't fix everything, she admitted. I know I can't save everyone, but some days it feels like I should be able to. I let her words settle before answering. You do more than you realize, Carla. She didn't say anything for a moment, and I wondered if I had said the right thing. Then, thank you. Her voice was quiet, but it held something I hadn't heard from her before. Vulnerability. It hit me then, just how much this meant. This call, this moment. She hadn't reached out to just anyone. She had reached out to me. And that meant something. An offer that changed everything. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, the conversation shifting into something lighter. She started to sound more like herself again, teasing, laughing softly, making me forget the exhaustion in my own body. Then, just as we were about to hang up, she said something that caught me completely off guard. "Hey, I know this is kind of last minute," she said, "but what are you doing this weekend?" I blinked, caught between surprise and curiosity. "Nothing set in stone." "Why?" A slight hesitation. Then, "I was thinking, I could use a break. And I remember you saying you used to hike." I sat up straighter. "Yeah, I did." "Why?" A small smile crept into her voice. "Well, maybe it's time you got back into it." I felt something shift inside me, an excitement I hadn't expected. "You asking me on an adventure, Dr. Williams?" She laughed, and this time it was genuine. Something like that. I grinned. "I'm in." A step into something new. By the time I hung up, something had settled in my chest. This was more than just coffee, more than a casual friendship. We were stepping into something new, something uncharted. And I wasn't afraid of it. I wanted it. For the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to something. And that meant everything. An unexpected pause. After we hung up, I stayed on the couch, phone still in hand, staring at the screen like it might offer me some kind of insight. I didn't expect to feel this. Off kilter. I wasn't unhappy, not even close, but it was strange how quickly I'd gone from cautiously intrigued to genuinely excited about seeing her again. Even so, the feeling wasn't simple. Carla's voice on the phone had sounded different. Not just tired, human. It was a reminder that she wasn't some perfect, unshakable figure in a white coat. She was just a person trying to make sense of the weight she carried. I could hear it in the way she described her day, how she lingered over certain details. She cared deeply, maybe more than she let on. It was that same sense of care that had drawn me in from the start. But her sudden vulnerability also raised questions. Was this hike her way of clearing her head, of finding space to breathe? Was it just a casual outing, or something more? The line between the two was blurry. I could sense it, and I wondered if she could too. What was clear, though, was that she trusted me, enough to call me after a hard day, enough to invite me on this little excursion. I felt the weight of that trust, and for once, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something I wanted to carry. Planning for the hike. I spent the next few days bouncing between my usual routine and a newfound eagerness to prepare. I dug out an old pair of hiking boots from my closet, brushed off the dust, and tried them on. They still fit, surprisingly. I found a weathered backpack I hadn't used in years and checked that the zippers still worked. The thought of hiking again felt almost foreign. I hadn't been out on a trail since my early 20s, back when I had more time and fewer responsibilities. In some ways, this felt like a return to an older, freer version of myself, someone I hadn't seen in years. And the fact that Carla had suggested it made it all the more meaningful. I wanted to be ready, not just physically, but mentally. It was more than just a hike. It was a chance to get to know her in a different context, to see how we connected outside the confines of work and cafes. It was also an opportunity to see what was real between us. By Friday night, I was more than prepared. My boots were broken in enough. My bag was packed with water bottles and snacks, and I'd even found an old rain jacket in case the forecast changed. The only thing I couldn't prepare for was what it would feel like to spend a day with Carla, miles away from the usual rhythms of our lives. The morning of the day of the hike arrived with crisp air and a clear sky. I woke up earlier than I'd planned, mostly out of nervous energy. I checked the weather one last time, made myself a light breakfast, and tried to keep my expectations in check. This was just a hike, after all, just two people spending time together. No big deal, but it did feel like a big deal. I left my apartment with my gear in tow and met her at a small parking area at the edge of the trail. She was already there, leaning against her car, dressed in weather-appropriate layers and sturdy boots. She smiled when she saw me, and that one small gesture was enough to ease my nerves. "Ready to hit the trail?" she asked, her voice light and easy. "Absolutely," I said, smiling back. And I meant it. We started walking, the gravel crunching underfoot as we made our way to the trailhead. The forest enveloped us quickly, the trees forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into gentle, shifting patterns on the ground. The air smelled fresh, like earth and pine, and the faint hint of dew evaporating in the morning warmth. It felt good to be out there, away from the buzz of the city. The connection deepens. As we walked, our conversation ebbed and flowed. Sometimes we'd go quiet, just listening to the sounds of the forest, the birds chirping, the rustling leaves, the occasional distant call of another hiker. Other times, we'd fall into a comfortable rhythm of talking. We shared stories about our families, our childhoods, the strange twists and turns that had brought us to where we were now. Carla told me about how she used to hike with her father when she was younger. "He was the one who got me into this," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He always said that nature has a way of clearing your head." I didn't fully understand it then, but I do now. I nodded. "It's the same for me. I used to come out here when I needed to think. When I stopped hiking, it felt like I lost something, like a piece of myself." I glanced at her. "I'm glad you suggested this. I didn't realize how much I missed it." She smiled softly. "I think we both needed it." It wasn't just the scenery that felt right. It was the company. She was easy to talk to, and the more we shared, the more I felt like I understood her. The doctor I'd met in the clinic was still there, but I was also getting to know Carla. The person who loved the outdoors, who worried about her patients, who carried a quiet strength that made her all the more compelling. A quiet moment. At one point, we stopped to take in the view. The trail had led us to a rocky overlook, and from there, we could see miles of forest stretching out before us, the tops of trees swaying gently in the wind. The sun was higher now, casting everything in a warm golden light. We stood there side by side, not speaking for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. It was a shared moment that didn't need words. I glanced at her, and she looked back at me, her expression calm but thoughtful. There was something in her eyes I couldn't quite place, a depth, a quiet understanding. "Thanks for this," I said finally. "For everything." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that said more than words could. "You don't have to thank me," she said, "but you're welcome." The walk back. The return trip felt different. Not because we were tired. We weren't. But because the mood had shifted. It wasn't just two people walking anymore. It felt like we had crossed an invisible line. We weren't strangers, and we weren't just acquaintances. Something deeper was forming, even if we couldn't define it yet. When we got back to the parking area, we stood by our cars for a moment, lingering. "I had a good time," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "We should do this again." I smiled. "Definitely. I think I owe you a coffee next time, though. Fair's fair." She laughed. "You're on." As I watched her drive away, I couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a one-time thing. It wasn't just a hike. It wasn't just coffee. It was the beginning of something we were both starting to see, something worth exploring. Coffee turns into dinner. By the time I called her that following week, my usual hesitations were starting to give way to a growing sense of curiosity. After our hike, the way she had looked at me before driving off stayed with me, replaying in my mind like a favorite scene from a film. I told myself it wasn't anything special, that it was just the natural way she carried herself, calm, assured, and kind. But deep down, I knew better. When I heard her voice on the other end of the line, light and warm, I felt my chest loosen in a way that was becoming all too familiar. "Hey, Dylan. I was wondering when I'd hear from you again," she teased. I laughed, running a hand through my hair. "I thought I'd give you a few days to recover from my hiking pace. Didn't want to scare you off." "You'll have to try harder than that," she said with a smile in her voice. So, what's on your mind? I hesitated for a fraction of a second. How about dinner? There was a pause, just long enough for me to question myself, before she replied. Dinner sounds great. The unexpected invitation. A few days later, we found ourselves in a cozy little Italian restaurant tucked into a quiet neighborhood I'd never explored before. She had suggested the place, claiming it had the best homemade pasta in the city. I was skeptical at first, but the moment I walked in and caught the rich aroma of garlic and fresh basil, I knew I was in for something special. Carla arrived a few minutes after me, a scarf draped loosely around her neck and a smile that lit up the room. I stood to greet her, feeling that same flutter in my chest I'd felt on the hike. She sat across from me, setting her bag down and shrugging out of her coat, her movements fluid and unhurried. It was like she belonged here, in this warm and inviting space. Good choice, I said, glancing around. I don't think I've ever been anywhere quite like this. She smiled, a bit mischievously. Well, I couldn't let you have all the fun picking spots, could I? The waitress arrived to take our orders, and we quickly fell into the easy rhythm of conversation. The words flowed as effortlessly as the wine we were sipping, light, natural, with just enough teasing to keep the mood playful. We talked about everything, from childhood memories to our most embarrassing moments, and with each story, I felt the space between us shrink. But it wasn't just about the words. It was the way she leaned in slightly when I spoke, her eyes meeting mine and holding them just a beat longer than expected. It was the way she laughed, not polite or forced, but a genuine laugh that made her shoulders shake and her cheeks flush. It was the quiet moments when we didn't need to say anything at all, when the warmth of her presence was enough. A deeper understanding. At one point, as the dishes were cleared and dessert menus offered, our conversation took a more serious turn. Carla spoke about her early years in medicine, how she considered emergency work before choosing a small clinic, how she sometimes wondered if she'd made the right choice. There was no regret in her voice, but there was an openness, a vulnerability that made me realize how much trust she was placing in me by sharing it. I know it might sound strange, she said, tracing her finger along the edge of her glass, but sometimes I think the quieter moments matter more than the big, dramatic ones. A patient who finally feels comfortable enough to open up about something that's been bothering them. That can mean more than treating a broken bone. It's those little connections that remind me why I do what I do. I nodded, letting her words sink in. It doesn't sound strange at all. I think we need those small moments. They're what make everything else feel real. She looked at me then, her expression softening. You get it. There was something unspoken between us in that moment, a shared understanding that went beyond words. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just talking to someone I admired or liked. I was talking to someone who saw the world in a way that made sense to me, someone who valued the same quiet, meaningful connections that I did. The walk home. After dinner, we decided to walk rather than take a cab. The air was cool and crisp, and the streets were quieter now, the rush of the evening having settled into a calm stillness. She walked close beside me, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. Every so often, our shoulders would brush, and each time it happened, I felt a small surge of warmth. You know, she said, breaking the comfortable silence, I wasn't sure what I was getting into when I handed you that note at the clinic. I glanced at her, my breath forming faint clouds in the night air. Yeah. And what do you think now? She smiled, her gaze steady. I think I made the right choice. I felt my face heat, but I didn't look away. You're full of surprises, you know that. So are you, she replied, her voice soft. I didn't expect to find someone who'd understand. Someone who'd just get it. The vulnerability in her words caught me off guard. It wasn't something she wore on her sleeve, but when it came through, it felt genuine and rare. I wanted to reach out, to hold that fragile moment, and let her know I felt the same. But instead, I just nodded, my voice low and certain. I get it. We walked on in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing gently against the buildings. When we reached her building, she stopped, turning to face me. "Thanks for tonight," she said, her smile returning. "I needed that." "Me too," I admitted. "I guess I owe you again for picking such a great place." Her eyes glimmered with amusement. "I'll keep that in mind." I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should say more, if I should ask her what she was thinking or feeling. But something about the way she looked at me made me pause. There was no rush, no need to define anything just yet. It felt like we had time. So instead, I simply said goodnight and watched as she disappeared into the building. A new kind of connection. Walking home, I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my mind. The conversation, her laugh, the way she opened up about her work. It all felt so natural, so easy. Yet there was a depth to it, a sense that we were building something more than just casual encounters. This was more than coffee or dinner. It was more than a hike. It was a connection that I hadn't seen coming, one that was growing stronger with each passing day. And as I unlocked the door to my apartment, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation, a subtle shift that told me this was only the beginning. The turning point. The days after our dinner settled into a strange, almost dreamlike rhythm. I went to work, dealt with the usual barrage of emails and meetings, but my mind wasn't fully there. Every so often, I'd find myself drifting back to that evening, her laughter, her honesty, the quiet moments when we both just sat there, taking it all in. I couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Did she feel the same pull, the same slow-burning certainty that something was unfolding between us? I told myself not to rush it. But of course, that was easier said than done. When Carla called the following Friday, her voice on the line immediately wiped away any nervous anticipation I'd been feeling. She sounded more relaxed, almost playful, as if she'd been looking forward to speaking to me, just as much as I had been waiting to hear from her. "Hey," she said, her tone light. "What are you doing tomorrow?" "Nothing too exciting," I admitted. "Why? You have something in mind." "I do, actually," she said. "There's a street fair downtown. Food vendors, live music, that sort of thing." I thought it might be fun. I smiled, already liking the sound of it. "That does sound fun." "Great," she said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "How about we meet there around noon?" The street fair. When I arrived, the street was alive with color and sound. Strings of lights crisscrossed above the booths, even in the midday sun, casting playful patterns on the pavement. The air smelled like roasted nuts, sweet caramel, and the savory tang of grilled meats. Crowds of people milled about, children tugging at their parents' hands, street performers juggling or strumming guitars, laughter and chatter filling the air. Carla was easy to spot. She was standing near a booth selling handmade jewelry, examining a pair of earrings with an amused smile. I approached, and when she saw me, her smile widened. "Hey," she said, slipping the earrings back onto the rack. "Perfect timing. Something catch your eye?" I asked, nodding toward the display. She shrugged. "They're pretty, but I'm not much of a jewelry person." We started walking, weaving through the crowd as we explored the stalls. Every so often, she would stop to admire a handcrafted scarf or a painted canvas. Her enthusiasm was contagious. I found myself drawn into her world, the way she appreciated each little piece of artistry as though it held its own story. She seemed more at ease here, laughing freely, her energy unburdened by the weight of her work. After a while, we came across a vendor selling homemade desserts. Carla's eyes lit up when she saw a tray of delicate fruit tarts. "These look amazing," she said. "You have to try one." She bought two, handing one to me before taking a bite of her own. I watched her face light up as she tasted it, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Good?" I asked. She nodded, her mouth full, and held up her hand in a gesture that clearly meant better than good. I took a bite, and she was right. It was perfect. The flaky crust, the sweet cream, the burst of fresh fruit. It was the kind of thing you'd never think to make for yourself, but once you tasted it, you wondered how you'd ever lived without it. We found a quiet corner near a fountain to sit and finish our tarts. The sound of the water provided a calming backdrop, softening the buzz of the crowd around us. For a moment, it felt like the two of us were in our own little bubble, the rest of the world fading into the background. The conversation that changed everything. As we sat there, Carla glanced down at the remains of her tart, her expression thoughtful. Then she looked at me. "Dylan," she began, her tone quieter now. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, meeting her gaze. "Do you ever feel like your life isn't yours? Like you've been living it for someone else's expectations, or just going through the motions because it's easier than trying to figure out what you really want?" The question caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting something so heavy, not here in the middle of a street fair. But as I thought about it, I realized she had put into words something I'd felt for a long time. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I have. Especially lately. It's like I got so caught up in work and responsibilities that I stopped asking myself if I was actually happy. I just assumed that as long as I was productive, that was enough. But it's not." She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "I know that feeling. It's why I chose the clinic over the hospital. Everyone said I was crazy to turn down the prestige, the salary, the big career. But I knew if I went that route, I'd lose myself. I wanted something simpler, something that felt real." "And did it work?" I asked. "Do you feel like you're living your life for yourself now?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Most days, yes, but there are still times I wonder if I'm doing it right." I didn't know what to say at first. The vulnerability in her voice, the way she opened up so easily, made me feel closer to her than ever. It was a reminder that she wasn't just the confident, composed doctor I'd first met. She was someone who questioned herself, who made tough choices, who was still figuring things out, just like me. "I think," I said after a moment, "that as long as you're trying to live your life on your own terms, you're already doing something right." Her smile grew a little brighter. "Maybe you're right." The quiet walk home. As the afternoon turned into evening, we wandered through the fair one last time before heading back toward her place. The crowds had thinned out, and the string lights overhead glowed brighter as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We walked slowly, neither of us in a hurry. The conversation had turned lighter again. Jokes about the overly enthusiastic street performers, debates over which booth had the best snacks. But there was an unspoken warmth between us now. The kind of warmth that comes from seeing someone in a new light, from hearing their doubts, and realizing they aren't so different from your own. When we reached her building, she paused before heading inside. She turned to me, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "Thanks for coming out today," she said. "I needed it." "Me too," I said, more than I realized. She hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she smiled and nodded. "Good night, Dylan." "Good night, Carla." A moment of realization. Walking home, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was more than just a series of outings, more than a friendly connection. It was something that had taken root without me even realizing it. Something that had the potential to grow into something real and lasting. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of that. I wasn't worried about where it might lead or what it might mean. I just knew that I wanted to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I found myself smiling. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew I wanted Carla to be part of it. And that thought alone was enough to make me feel like I was finally living my life, not for anyone else's expectations, but for myself and for her. The new beginning. The next few weeks unfolded in a way I hadn't expected. Carla and I kept seeing each other, not every day, not in any rushed or forced way, but just enough to feel the pull growing stronger. Each conversation seemed to flow more easily than the last. Each small moment, laughing over bad movies, walking through the park on quiet afternoons, sharing stories that revealed more about who we were, built something I could feel solidifying between us. We never talked about labels or made any grand declarations. We didn't need to. Whatever this was, it felt natural, like a tide that had been steadily rising before either of us realized it. The walls I'd built around myself, years of focus on work, of burying anything that felt too messy or uncertain, were no longer as sturdy as they once seemed. And I didn't mind. One evening, after another simple dinner together, we ended up at her place, sitting side by side on the couch. She was flipping through a photo album she had pulled from a shelf, pointing out snapshots of her hiking trips, vacations, family gatherings. It wasn't the kind of moment that would have felt significant to anyone else, but to me, it was everything. She was letting me into her life in a way that was so ordinary, so effortless, and yet so meaningful. As she turned the page to a picture of her standing atop a mountain, wine-blown and smiling, she glanced at me. "You know, I never thought I'd meet someone who'd get this side of me." I looked at the photo, then back at her. "And I never thought I'd meet someone who'd make me want to find that side of myself again." We didn't need to say much more. The quiet between us was enough to convey what we both already knew. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. The kind of story I hadn't dared to believe was possible, filled with the small, beautiful moments that made life feel full. It was real. It was ours. And it was just getting started.